So we're going to finish up tonight the last few pages under contracts, Unit 10, and then we're going to get into our lecture on financing, Unit 14. And then next Monday, the discussion will be on Unit 15. So tonight we're going to do a little bit of financing math. We're going to talk about discount points. We're going to talk about the principal and interest payment and how to get that. We're going to talk about interest over the life of the loan, how to do that math. And I'm going to show you about amortizing a loan. So we'll do a little bit of math tonight. And then Monday night, the only math that's in Unit 15 is qualifying the buyer math. So that will be done Monday night. But getting back to the conclusion of Unit 10, on page 311, we stopped at some of this addendum, and I asked you to look over it so that you would know when this would be appropriate. And the association disclosure and condominium resale statement for property that is exempt from the residential property disclosure form. The residential property disclosure form is for residential property owners, 1 to 4 family dwelling. There are some exemptions to that where the owner does not have to give it out. And the exemptions, for example, would be new construction. You know, the questions are, how old is the roof? Does the furnace work? And those questions don't make sense on new construction. If it was an estate sale or a foreclosure, those will not be applicable for the owner giving out the residential property disclosure statement. So there could be this information that would be needed even on those properties that are exempt. So it talks about the association, and remember the condominium resale statement addendum is about what are the association dues and fees and that sort of thing. If you'll remind yourself, buying a brand new condo, there has to be property information given before the offer's written. A public offering statement would be a good thing to call it. And the developer is to make sure that the new buyer has that. And in that language, there's a 7-day right to rescind on a brand new condo. So on a resale, there's not that rescission period, but there may be disclosure needed if there's an association, and yeah, if there's an association, that would be needed. Vacation rental addendum. If we were in real estate in an area that had resort properties for sale, we would be talking more about vacation rentals. We will discuss vacation rentals in Unit 11, but let me just tell you one little thing about under the Vacation Rental Act. We know that we're not allowed to pay referral fees to anyone who does not have an active real estate license. So someone wanting to send you business, in order to pay them, and according to license law, they would have to have a license on active status. There's one exception to that, and that would be under the Vacation Rental Act. A travel agent can send a real estate broker a lead, and you can pay them a referral fee for that lead even if they don't have a real estate license. That's the only exception. And the other thing that goes with that is the travel agent may not participate in the transaction, the writing of the lease or anything like that because they're not in the real estate business. But that one would be the one exception where a referral fee could be paid to someone who does not have a real estate license. Otherwise, not allowed. We're going to talk about short sales a little bit again tonight, but short sales, someone tell me how you would describe a short sale. What's your understanding of a short sale?
Like 2 weeks.
What?
It's a hardship.
It's a hardship sale, and what else?
I thought it was a short sale, like 2 weeks.
No, your mortgage is higher. The money
You
that
owe more than
owe.
what your
Oh, it goes upside
value
down.
that you've got.
Yes. You owe more than what the property is worth. The value of the property is less than what you owe. So that happened a lot when we went through the financial crisis. People paid more for houses during the real estate bubble, And since they paid more, they borrowed more, and then the bubble burst and things came crushing down, and people ended up owing more than what their property was worth. Some of those folks got into the loan, that got into qualifying for the loan, maybe when they shouldn't have. Loans were made to people who had very low credit scores. Loans were made, these adjustable rate mortgages where the interest rate is really low the first year. The graduated payment mortgage, the interest rate is really low the first year. And so when the rates go up, like they would in an adjustable rate loan and in a graduated payment loan, then the people that don't have the income appropriately for that rate, or if one of the spouses lost a job, well then they're going to be in more dire straits. And so oftentimes these short sales are with owners who are on the edge of foreclosure. Sometimes you'll see the terminology pre-foreclosure. And so they're asking the lender to take less than what is due them. And so we say the owner's upside down. And so they're asking the lender to take a shortage. Will you take less than I owe? And the IRS sees it as loss to the lender, income or gain to the owner. So if some debt is forgiven, the IRS wants a 1099 form going out to the person who had the shortage. They're going to pay income tax on that amount that was forgiven, because it's almost like they were given a credit. So if we're selling a property and it's going through a short sale, this addendum, there's an addendum that would be attached to the listing agreement, because that's when we would find it out on the seller side, and then there would be an addendum attached to the offer to purchase. The backup contract addendum, what did you gather when you read about that? Backup contract addendum. Kim?
A property that is already under contract,
Right.
but wanted to make sure that things, just in case things fell through. So what the owner would do was still receive offers.
And that they could accept and have as a contract with the backup addendum, which means they're not bound to two sales contracts. Kim said that it would be beneficial to the owner. They're under contract already, but we've got our due diligence period, don't we? And buyers can walk away for any reason during that time frame. And so maybe they would still allow showings and accept a backup offer that they would look at. And if they like it, they would sign it as a contract. As long as the addendum is there, the addendum protects them, because it says the second contract is in second position and there is a primary contract. If it falls through, the second backup will become primary. Do you think that houses right now in the market that we're in, do you think that real estate agents are writing backup offers?
No,
What did you say?
I said no.
Why no?
Because when people know what they want, they pretty much go after for what they want, especially with the shortage. So once they know what they want, they just go for it versus the sellers having to want backup orders, because they have their ducks in order.
Kim's saying that since there's a shortage of housing, maybe the buyers are not backing out as much under the due diligence. What did you want to say, Elizabeth?
So I said that if I'm a seller, I want it.
Yeah. I agree. I personally agree with that. I don't know that that's the way it's working in the real estate field, and I wonder about that, and I'm not doing that business anymore, but it seems like a seller would want a backup, particularly with the due diligence period, and the buyer can walk away just because they want to. One morning they wake up and say, I just don't want to buy that house. And it seems like the seller would want some comfort. Well, comfort wouldn't be the right word, but some security with another contract. I don't think many agents are writing them though. And so it makes me wonder why not. And here's a legitimate reason. If a property is under contract, under the due diligence period, that would be listed in multiple listing service, because anybody searching to find houses to show their buyer, that would be listed. This one's already under contract, waiting due diligence period. Some will also say accepting backups. A lot don't say that. And I'm curious, why not accept backups? And here's a legitimate reason for both sides. Sellers may be tired of showing their property. I mean, that does get a little bit old, getting up, making the beds, having everything put away, getting the children out. And so a seller might say, thank goodness we've got an offer that we can take. We're a little bit tired of that. Buyers and their agents may not want to look at a house that's already under contract and get their hopes up that it may not go through. So I do see both sides. I still would probably, if I were in the real estate business, I would probably suggest to the seller, why don't we leave the house, why don't we accept backups? We have to disclose it's under contract, but why don't we accept backups? Now, probably won't get a ton of showings because real estate agents are in charge of picking the properties usually to show their buyers, but all you need is one in case it falls through. What do y'all think? If you were a seller, would you want to have your house still being shown for the people who will show it? Or would you be just ready to say, let's just see how this one pans out?
I think it just depends on the situation.
Like, what do you
It's
mean,
an older
Kevin?
couple that say they don't have a mortgage any longer, just downsizing because the kids are gone, they're not in a hurry,
Yeah.
they really have no severe motivation
Mm-hmm.
to get rid of it.
So if they don't
Why
have,
they wouldn't want it.
what now?
That might be why they wouldn't want it,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's not a valid concern for them at that point.
Makes sense.
And it's still being an MLS service, if you have an investor or something, you know, someone that's also not in a hurry to purchase,
Mm-hmm.
kind of set that one on the back burner. Hey, it's under contract, we can keep an eye on it, just see what happens.
Valid point. Kevin said if the owner's not really that motivated with urgency, you know, they don't have a mortgage or they hadn't found maybe another house right away, something like that, it might not matter to them if they get a backup. And he said a buyer might say to their agent, just keep an eye on that property. You know, when it gets ready for the due diligence date to expire, check and see if that contract's still good and let us know, we can go then. Legitimate answers. I remember when my niece had her house on the market and the contract was used, this same contract, the due diligence contract that we have on our Form 2T, it went under contract, and of course she starts texting me, asking me a lot of questions. And I was always real careful because I don't want to interfere with her agent. You know, her agent needs to give her advice, not me. But she said the property went under contract, and I asked her, I said, how long is your due diligence period? And she said, what's that? And I said, how much money did you get? We didn't get any money. I said, are you keeping on showing your house? No. And I said, why not? I mean, I was sort of acting a little bit like an agent, you know, in the background, but it depends on what the agent is advising, and you take their expertise too. If they're in that marketplace, maybe they feel one way and they're advising their client, and that's okay too. So the backup contract addendum is I think it's a pretty good thing. When the inventory is short, like it is now, people might say, hey, I'll take a chance and wait. The contingent sale addendum, contingent means conditional. So this is conditional or subject to the buyer either selling their house that hasn't sold yet or selling their house and closing it out. So it could be under contract, their house already, and they just need to close it, of course, to get the proceeds before they buy another property. So a contingent sale addendum would be attached if a buyer wants to make an offer and they still have a house to sell. So let me throw the same question out to you. Do you think that that contingent sale addendum is used much in the real estate market that we're in today?
I think so.
Okay, it's not. The contingent sale addendum is not used much today, from what I hear from my post-broker students anyway. When we'll look at that addendum when you come back for your post-education, but the contingent sale addendum protects the buyer, and the time frame protects the buyer, and what looks like is the seller's waiting for the buyer to get their sale and get their closing. There's a lot of technicality in the terminology about that, and if the buyer gets their house under contract, they're supposed to get a copy of that to the seller right away. It doesn't appear that it's as favorable to the seller as it is to the buyer. So a lot of agents don't use that or don't recommend it. Now, it's not our decision after all, though, is it? It's up to the seller and the buyer if that's what they want to do. But our job is there to explain what the form means, explain how it affects the folks. But according to the broker's class I just finished teaching, they're telling me they're not using it very much. If the market, if there's not much inventory, the sellers know that they're in the driver's seat, they're in more control, and they want to get the best offer they can. If they're tied up waiting on somebody to sell their home, it might limit them on getting the best terms. Then again, you could look at the positive. If houses are selling fast, one would think that the buyer's house that he needs to sell in order to buy would sell fast. You know, it all just kind of depends on which way you want to look at it, and it's going to depend on the seller's needs and the buyer's needs. So on 312 and 313, we talked about presenting the offers. We talked about, didn't we talk about all offers must be presented immediately, no later than 5 days. And we talked about any change that a buyer or seller may make technically would be a strike through, a pen and ink change, initial, and dated. Now, in the market we're in now, with all technology we have, lots of the changing and the negotiation is happening there via email, and there's DocuSign, and a lot of that's happening that way. The response to the buyer's form, did we talk about that? Seems like I remember talking about it. Do y'all remember it? Well, so what do you think it means? Response to buyer's offer. It's not a counter. It's not a counter. So if it's not a counter, what do you think it would be? Not an acceptance. Rejection. Guys, think about this for a moment. If a buyer makes an offer on the seller's home and the real estate agent presents it, and the seller says, I don't want it, and the agent says, well, why don't we make a counteroffer? Why don't we at least negotiate? And the owner might say, you know what, they've insulted me. That is such a low offer, I'm not even going to work with them. And that really happens in real life. So when you're working with buyers, yes, they want the lowest terms probably, the best terms for them. But sometimes you need to, as a buyer's agent, say, that may not be in your best interest to offer that low, because you can tick the seller off, offend the seller, and they won't even want to work with you at all. You know, we understand people want to offer less. Everybody wants to negotiate, but there is a part of negotiating that you really need to tread lightly, because if you offend the seller and they say, I'm not working with this person, they've upset me. Residential real estate is pretty emotional, to be honest with you. And so as an agent, you're there hopefully to keep cool heads and to keep it steady. But a response to the buyer's offer is a rejection letter. It basically says, thank you for your offer, but we reject it. And it goes on to say, maybe if the seller wants to, we might consider these terms. That is not a counteroffer. It's not an offer. It's just basically saying resubmit if you want to, and we might consider these terms, but it's not an obligation on the seller's part to accept those terms. I was showing a property for an agent who was going out of town, and she asked me, she said, will you show property to this buyer if she calls? And she probably ain't gonna call. Well, that doesn't work out that way. When people go out of town, their business gets real busy. It's ironic how that happens. And this buyer, she said, wouldn't called me about every day, wanting me to show her houses. Now, I told the agent, I'll look out for your business while you're gone. Well, I showed this buyer houses, and we found one house that she really liked. And the seller who lived there was an older couple, and I'm sure they were attached to her home. And this buyer was more interested in how fast can you get out, and, you know, asking, it appeared aggressive questions. You know, it just was like that. I could just see the older couple, you know, just not being used to that kind of questioning. Well, she made an offer on the property. This was a new listing. She made an offer on the property. I presented it to the listing agent and get a call a little bit later, and the call said the offer was rejected. So I called the buyer up and I said, your offer was rejected. And she lit into me big time. And here's what she said. How do I know you presented it? Now, personally, I was offended because I had a good reputation as a real estate agent. It offended me, but I called my broker in charge, because even when you're a full broker, which I was back then, even if you're a full broker, non-provisional, if something isn't going right, if you just feel like something's going wrong, and that was obvious, I called my BIC and I said, you know, she doesn't think I presented the offer, and I need somebody to step in and make, you know, and settle this. And so the BIC called the other company's BIC, and that BIC personally called her and said your offer was presented. The seller had multiple offers, and they chose another offer. But this form, response to the buyer's offer, I think it's a really good idea, and her point is not a bad point. If nothing's signed where they didn't say we reject and initial it, I mean, that's a pretty valid point if you think about it, right? And so having this response to the buyer's offer, or something saying, we looked over your offer, it was presented, and we rejected. At least you've got something in your file that you have a paper trail. And so that's a good form for that. Everybody should get a copy of everything it is that they signed. So from the very beginning, when a buyer makes an offer, you need to give a copy to the buyer. When you present the offer to the seller needs to have a copy of it. And, you know, going back and forth, if you are with negotiations, everybody needs to get a copy of everything that they're signing at the time. And when we make these final original copies, the lender wants a copy, the attorney who's going to close the loan wants a copy. If there are multiple agents, they want a copy. The companies, the real estate firms want a copy too. I would remember, however, if we only have one original contract with signatures on it, that's a contract. If we met, you know, if we did the offer and the acceptance and the communicate, if you've got one original copy, it's a contract. In other words, it doesn't take multiple copies to make a contract. Remember when we talked about the 4 essential elements? It didn't say how many copies do you have to make a contract. If you've got one and it met the, you know, the 4 essentials, including the mutual agreement, then you've got a contract. It just makes sense, though, for everybody to get a copy. Go back with me, though, to page 313. I want to point something out to you. And I don't believe it was, well, I don't know, it might have been this class. Y'all have to remind me. Look at your 3rd paragraph down, last 3 lines. Shopping the offer by brokers has long been considered unethical and is now illegal in North Carolina. Shopping the offers, you know, just kind of out, creating a bidding war. That's not what we do in North Carolina now. I know some states, because I've seen it on those house shows, you know, some states they do it, but not in North Carolina. All righty, page 314. let's talk about the installment land contract, and then we'll talk about option contracts. The installment land contract, the terminology is pretty descriptive except for one thing. Lots of students, when they hear this term or see it, they think it's a contract with vacant land. And the land word doesn't mean that it's for land only. Remember back in Unit 1 when we were looking at the definition of real estate and real property, we said the land's there first, and then improvements are added, and then the bundle of rights. And I believe we talked about if we see the word land or real estate, we can use it all interchangeably in a broader sense. Installment land contract is not just for land. It's a contract that incorporates seller financing. So it's a seller financing and sales contract all in one. It's a little unique for a couple of reasons. That's one reason. Financing and a contract all in one. The unique part about this is the seller holds the deed. The seller keeps the title in their name until the last payment is made. And then they will transfer the title to the buyer. So during the time that the buyer's making payments, these installment payments, they are acquiring equity. And equity is the amount of money you're creating in your property, the difference between the value and what you owe. And they're creating equity, and they also have what we call equitable title. Equitable title is the title before you get the legal title. It's the rights you have of use and possession before you get the legal title. So equitable title they do not have legal title. And let me say, the morning class asked me, is this rent to own? It is not rent to own, and I know it might sound that way. I don't know what you would, there's not a rent to own contract. I can remember getting phone calls, phone calls while you're on phone duty. And oftentimes the call would say, do you have any houses rent to own? Now, I don't know what that means really. I mean, I sort of know what they're asking, but when I got that call, I would ask them, are you looking for a rental or are you looking to buy? And the thinking, I'm generalizing right now, but when someone calls and says, do you have anything rent to own? The idea that they're thinking, or the general idea is, the rent that I'm paying is going to go toward buying the property. And that's not how it works. If someone wants to do a rent with option to buy, that's 3 separate contracts, everybody. A rental agreement, an option contract, and a sales contract. And you and I cannot tie those together. Number one, we don't have any option contract forms. That is not something that we're allowed to do, draft it up in any way. An attorney would have to draw that up. An attorney would have to connect these 3 contracts together. You can't draft any language that kind of says they go together. This is the rental that goes with this option and the sales contract. So that's 3 contracts, everyone, and I don't believe that's what folks are thinking when they call in and say, do you have any houses rent to own? And so it takes a little bit of explaining, but first of all, well, what are you really looking for? And if they say, well, I want to rent a house, but I want to be buying it at the same time, and you might need to explain to them, well, the person who owns it, who would do financing, they may have other things they want to do with that money. They might have a mortgage that needs to be paid. And so all the money you're paying isn't going to go toward buying. It's going to go to the owner's profit, what they're making on this investment. Maybe a little bit would be applied to the purchase, but it isn't going to be the whole payment. So an installment land contract is a form of owner financing where the seller says, I don't need all my cash, I'll take installment payments, and the buyer is building equitable title. So tell me this, knowing what it means, what would be the advantages to the seller and then the advantages to the buyer? First of all, the advantages to the seller would be what?
They get to keep the title.
There's a big advantage. Angel said they get to keep the title. So why would that be advantageous other than the obvious? Why would that be advantageous?
If something ends up happening later on, I mean, you still got the
You still own it.
right.
No litigation.
What now?
No litigation, it's yours.
It's yours. So there is a term that comes up in this section. It's called forfeiture. Seems like we saw that on a multiple choice quiz. Excuse me, everybody. If the buyer defaults, the payments will be forfeited. So any monies that they've got in that property would be forfeited if there's a default and it can't be cured. So the monies don't go back to the buyer. And any equity that they might have built, was, by the time they bought, have been making payments, they lose that. The seller has the legal title and they would have the property back. So that's an advantage to the seller. What else may be?
Capital gains tax?
Capital gains. Capital gains tax, if they're not getting all their profit in one lump sum, they're not going to be paying one lump sum capital gains tax. They'll be paying a little bit at a time toward capital gains based on how much money they're getting on the installments. So what would be the disadvantage to the seller?
If you needed all that cash.
Yeah, if you need the cash. You know what? I sold real estate for about 30 years. I never had a seller do seller finance. And so I don't think it's really as common, maybe as it may sound like in our reading. Now, investors may be prone to offer financing because, one thing about it is the benefit to the buyer may be they could have bad credit or no credit and they can't get a loan at a regular bank, and so they're asking the owner to finance. If the owner's going to take that risk, they'll probably charge a little higher interest rate, don't you think, than what the banks may be even charging. So the disadvantage, the seller might say, I just want all my money so I can go do something else. The advantage to the buyer is maybe they can't get financing anywhere else. What would be a disadvantage to the buyer? They don't have the title. That's exactly right. Look with me at the top of 315. Second paragraph, there's no standard form, and if there's not a standard form, we will not be preparing anything like this. If it should come up in conversation with the owner of the property saying, I'll offer financing, or with the buyer saying, will the owner offer financing, we would have to say, we need to have an attorney prepare that document for us. And if you'll notice that, it needs to be in writing to be enforceable. The Statute of Frauds says that real estate conveyance instruments, like sales contracts, leases of longer than 3 years, deeds, options, they need to be in writing to be enforceable. And then, of course, our contract says, let's record a memorandum or something that can be placed on record without all the details about the personal payments and all of that. Let's put a memorandum on record. It creates a cloud on the title so the seller won't go out and sell it to someone else. They've got the legal title. What would prevent them from doing that unless we had something recorded? The other reason we record, everybody, this came up in your unit 5. When you were introduced to the contract, it says that we record to give constructive notice. We're constructively telling the world, we're telling third parties that we have a claim on this property. We've got interest in this property. The idea is to keep third-party interference away. If you look at your next paragraph, it's there are some rules if it's for a primary residence for the buyer. There are minimum things that that have to be included in a contract. And the other thing is there is a 3-day rescission period. Look at the bottom of your third paragraph there. It says that the buyer has 3 business days to cancel the contract following the signing of the contract. In 5 business days, the memorandum needs to be recorded. And the seller must give the buyer at least 30 days to cure any default. To cure any default, what does that mean? Make it up. Make it right. Catch up on the payments. Something like that. They are to be given 30 days to cure a defect. Alrighty, so you see the required provisions, and you can look over these at your leisure, and I believe if you read them, it makes real good sense. It's just standard language that would be appropriate for a sales agreement between buyer and seller. If you go to page 316, there needs to be something in there. Can the buyer prepay this loan? Because what if they have money and they want to pay it off? You know, there needs to be some language in there. Is there a prepayment penalty? And the description of the property would make sense. And about the taxes, someone asked me today, will the buyer pay the taxes on the property? Yes, of course they would. They're buying the property. Does everybody understand it? They're buying it. It's just the financing that's a little different. The buyer didn't go to a bank. They went to the owner and asked the owner to finance it. If you look at your last bullet point on 316, 14-point bold-faced type that says the buyer has a right to cancel. You know, they've got a 3-day right to cancel, so they need to know that. Any comments or questions about the installment land contract? By the way, I neglected to mention to you, go back to page 314. I neglected to mention to you, and this is important because you may see it on a test question. That's the most important thing for us right now. They call the installment land contract also a contract for deed, or they may simply call it a land contract. Now, if you see land contract, guys, are not talking about raw land. They're talking about this installment payment to the seller. The terminology contract for deed is a literal description. We're contracting to get the deed sometimes in the future. Let's go and talk about option. An option to purchase is a contract. That's one thing that I would remember. It's a contract. Options probably are more commonplace in commercial real estate. Options are fairly commonplace in commercial sales and maybe even in commercial leases, where maybe a commercial renter says to the landlord or the property manager, we want an option to rent the space next door should that become available. So options are contracts. I would remember who the parties are to an option. Oftentimes in your test questions, they'll use the terms of the people, and they expect us to know who's who. For example, in the sales contract we talked about earlier, the seller becomes the vendor and the buyer is the vendee. In an option contract, the owner, future seller maybe, would be called the optionor. The future maybe buyer would be called optionee. So I have one question to ask you. If you'll look at your last paragraph on 316, I'm going to read what mine says, and you tell me what yours says. The book I have a book that didn't have the corrections made, and some of you have not a new edition, but a new printing, and there were some corrections made. So mine says, last paragraph, if the optionor wishes to go forward. Who has that written? If the optionor, okay, cross it out because that's wrong. It should say if the optionee. If the optionee wants to go forward, they're the ones saying, hold it for me while I decide. So that word should say optionee, not optionor. And look at the next after the comma. If yours says the optionor must exercise his right, cross out optionor, it should say optionee. The optionee is the would-be buyer. They're in the driver's seat, everybody. They're asking the owner, the optionor, to hold this property for X amount of time, for this amount of money if they decide to buy it, and there would be an option fee more than likely. An option fee is like a due diligence fee in a way. What's the due diligence fee for in our standard form 2T?
Buying time.
Buying time. On an option, you're buying time. Hold this for me. It reminds me a little bit, not the same, but back in the olden days, their stores used to do layaway. Now, I know Kmart and some of the stores are doing that again, but layaway, you're kind of like saying, hold it for me until I come back and pay for it, or pay some more on it. Now, you've got at the last line, once an option has expired, if yours says the optionor no longer has the right, cross it out, it should say optionee. So all of that where you see optionor, it really needs to say optionee. So I apologize that yours, if yours is right, that's great. We didn't get a notice that they went in and changed some of the mistakes. And so I'm using the book with all the mistakes, and some of you had some of the mistakes corrected. Some of the proofing that didn't get proofed. So tell me this. What's the difference then between an option to purchase and the standard form 2T with our due diligence period? So think about that a minute. It's a little bit level 3 thinking, analyzing it and understanding it. What would be the difference between standard form due diligence period and option to purchase?
An option of purchase, it may never sell.
It may never sell. Okay, why?
Maybe they don't want to sell it.
Seller doesn't have a choice. If the seller signs it, if the seller commits and signs this option contract, they're bound. But I think what you're saying is the buyer might not decide to buy it because it's in the buyer's control, isn't it? Guys, on an option, the owner, the optionor, is bound. They are the only one bound to the terms that they agreed to, and it's unilateral contract. Since we said one's making a promise, the optionee is deciding, are they going to opt in? So what is a buyer on our sales contract 2T deciding?
If he's gonna opt out.
Are they going to opt out? So that's the real difference. Sales contract form 2T, the buyer is in the contract. And they've negotiated the due diligence period, and they're going to decide, are they going to terminate? Are they staying in, or are they terminating? On an option contract, the optionee, buyer if you will, is not in. They're going to decide, do they want to opt in? So it's the same idea, just opposite. An option contract there's not a form for that I mentioned to you earlier, but there used to be many years ago an option contract form. It really is above what we do in most residential. It wouldn't be anything you would attempt to try to write up. There's a lot of legalese to it, a lot of connecting dots, if you will. But I can remember seeing an option form, and it was just one page, not with a lot of writing on it, name of the person and the property, and then in the body of the option form, it said, see Exhibit A. Exhibit A would be attached and offered to purchase. Everything would be filled in because they're negotiating in advance. They're negotiating, they're just not signing it yet. So hold this at these terms, and we'll decide if we want to opt in. The thing about an option, I mentioned to you, the optionor is bound, optionee is not. If the optionee looks around and finds other property that's selling for less, they don't have to opt in, do they? They can say this isn't good. They could go back to the optionor and say, will you renegotiate because I found property that's sold for less? All right, let's think about it a different way. What if the optionee found out, boy, this is a good deal. The property that I'm looking at around this area is selling for way more. Guess who's bound to sell it for the price that they agreed to? The optionor is. So it would be really good as an optionor to make sure you know the fair market value of whatever property that you're agreeing to hold for that person, and there would be an option fee. Just like the due diligence fee, like Kevin mentioned, you're really buying time. You're asking them to hold it for a certain time. So the option fee would need to line up with how long are you asking to hold and maybe what the price is of the property. Generally speaking, the option fee is credited back at closing to the buyer, just like the due diligence fee is. If the buyer optionee decide not to opt in, well then that option fee typically is non-refundable for the time in holding the property. Look with me, if you will, requirements of options in North Carolina, page 317. All options need to be in writing according to the Statute of Frauds. Contract says it needs to be recorded in order to be enforceable against third-party claims. No standard form, and all the terms would need to be described and handled with care, and an attorney would be best to do that. Now, the ending of this unit, they're speaking about some other types of arrangements. They call them preemptive rights, and so before it would happen, if it happens. This little section is level 1, but let's just kind of review it briefly, if you will. I want you to take a moment and read over the right of first refusal. So look at that first, and then we'll talk about that. So someone paraphrase it in your own words for us. Anybody?
It's pretty much just saying if I do sell it, you'll still get the first shot at it.
If I do, big if. If I should decide to sell it, excuse me, or if I decide to rent it, release it, I'll give you the first right. So I'm promising if it ever happens, I'll give you the first right. So there's really not any binding terms or anything. The other thing about it, it says, or if I get an offer in, you know, somebody makes me an offer, I will give you first right to match that offer. And because I gave you a promise that I would give you first right. Let's look on the next page, and I want you to take a moment and read the right of first opportunity to purchase. Little bit similar, but a little bit different. I love what it says, and you may, this may not be what you're thinking, but I love what it says. This preemptive right endeavors to avoid some of the vague legalities of the right of first refusal. Now, the right of first refusal, there's not too much to it, is it, if I promise? And this way is to, avoid the vague irregularities. So tell me what you think about this one.
So, I need clarification because it's late or I'm tired or something.
Well, it seems like, I'm feeling your pain. That feels complicated.
That's,
To me, doesn't you? But it does get things more situated, I guess. So what is it?
So, the person who has this right
Uh-huh.
to buy, or first refusal,
First opportunity.
purchase. So, a seller decides to sell for a designated price, so they've already agreed on a price that he can sell it for.
Right. Or there could be language that says how the price would be determined.
Okay.
Like,
so market value
because it could be
something.
like 2 years.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what the market's gonna be. So, okay, so say we put language in that it's gonna be market value plus minus 10%, whatever,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So the person who has the right of first opportunity to purchase says, I don't wanna buy it.
Right?
So then the seller can go and sell for 90% to somebody else?
Well, that's an example. They would have to offer the same price, it says, unless the agreement says they could, for example, negotiate lower. So in other words, if they go to somebody else, in theory, it would be the same price. The agreement between the original two could have said, but second time around, you can negotiate like, for example, 90%. And if that other person, let's say third person, doesn't buy, then you gotta go back to the original person and offer them again. You kind of start all
What happens when I have a
over.
buyer who wants to pay more for it?
More than what?
That designated price?
Well, they offer it at the designated price first, I believe.
But
Isn't
they
that
offer it to, so,
to the second person?
yeah, my second person, so my first person said, no, I don't wanna buy it.
Right,
So now I go to somebody else and say, hey, I have this house, whatever, will you buy it for X?
same price.
Same price, and they say, yes, I'm good.
Mhm.
Or if they say, so if they say no, but give you 90%, let's say, I can still do it, but if he said no, I'll give you half, I couldn't sell it.
Not if it was written in there 90%. The 90%'s not set in stone. That's just for example.
So I
What
couldn't-
does EG stand for?
Yeah,
For example, but there are other
in
words,
Latin or something
yeah.
like that, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's a
Example given, that's what it stands for, example given. And so they could say 80% or 95%.
So if I'm gonna drop my price, I basically have to drop it for that first person first.
If the second person doesn't buy it.
Okay, that's more complicated.
You know what, it seems contradictory to the first statement. This is to avoid some of the vague irregularities, or is that what I said, legalities. Now, things would be written, here's the price and here's what you can negotiate, but it seems like it's really tying up the owner of the property, and why would you do that? I don't know, what would be the benefit? I can't think.
It's unnecessary.
I'm thinking only if it's family.
That's what I was gonna say, if it was your family,
Only
maybe.
If it was your
daughter.
family,
Maybe.
Yeah.
maybe. That
so the
makes
first
sense.
person, were they offered it at a discount rate too?
It says designated price. And if they don't take the designated price, you can go offer the designated price to somebody else or negotiate it if it was written in the agreement. If this person doesn't buy it, then you would have to go back. That doesn't seem right though,
No,
does it?
because what if the first person wanted to negotiate?
What if the
You're not
first
giving
person
them a
wanted to
chance.
negotiate? If the offer's declined, the seller can sell for the specified period for the designated price.
Right.
So there will be a time frame. It may allow the owner to sell for a percentage of the price. I mean, that doesn't seem right, does it? If the owner does not sell to the third party, the process begins anew with the first person for a designated price. Golly.
Only way I
Seems-
can see this being relevant anyway would be if you're a business owner and you have people working below you that have been with you for as long as the business has been there, and you give them first right to purchase, building the property or whatever, you're selling it out.
You know what, Kevin, I think what we're probably thinking, and my mind's going to, selling a house this way doesn't make sense.
I'm thinking
But real
commercial.
estate, I know, that's what I'm trying to say. Your example is, you're thinking outside the box. It might not be our 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. It might be, say it again what you said, so everybody can hear you.
If you have a building and a property,
A business,
business, for example, my father. My
Mhm.
father has an office spread outside Denton, going towards the lake, it's on like 6 acres of land. And he has guys that has been with him for 15, 20 years.
right?
And if he one day wants to get out of the business and they want to continue the same type of business, maybe carry on the name, whatever, he could give them the first right. So if Carl's been with him 20 years, Mike 18, so forth, Carl gets the first right, then they get the option. That way, I guess their years of working for him, they could pay off and be very beneficial in the long run.
I like that example. It would make more sense in a business endeavor like that to me, does it, y'all? Seems like it does. Anyways, I'd hate to say it this way. Forgive me, this is level 1. And so we know what it means basically, don't we? And let's don't overthink it, because sometimes when we overthink things, we'll mess up. So let's don't overthink it. So, since we're not going to overthink, let's take our first break.